In 1819, a German poet handed a young chemist a sack of green coffee beans and made a strange request. Find out what exists inside this that keeps people awake. The Poet was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The chemist Friedlieb Ferdinand Runge isolated for the first time a substance that humanity had already been consuming for centuries, without ever being able to see it, name it, or understand it. He called it caffeine. Today we know it by another name, caffeine. But this story does not begin in a German laboratory. It begins long before that, in forests, savannas, and mountains scattered across nearly every continent, where completely different plants, with no contact with one another, independently developed the same strange chemical survival strategy. And centuries later, human beings on opposite sides of the planet would arrive at the same conclusion about what to do with it. To understand how a molecule present in leaves, seeds, and bark became the most widely consumed psychoactive drug in the world, we need to go back to a time when no one knew it even had a name, let alone that one day it would move armies, empires, revolutions, and the global economy. Caffeine was not invented. It was discovered, ignored, feared, banned, smuggled, enslaved on plantations, glorified by kings, and finally bottled, capsuled, and sold back to the same humanity that had rejected it at first. Millions of years before any human civilization existed, certain plants began producing caffeine as poison. Not for humans, but for insects and fungi trying to devour their leaves and seeds. In concentrated doses, the substance paralyzes and kills small predators. It is a natural insecticide. What is curious is that completely distinct plant species, the coffee shrub in Africa, the tea plant in Asia, the cacao tree in Central America, the cola tree in West Africa, guarana in the Amazon, and yerba mate in South America, arrived independently at the same chemical solution. Biologists call this convergent evolution. None of these plants copied another. Each simply discovered, in its own way, that a small, bitter molecule could mean survival. What no one expected was that, in small doses, this same substance created to kill insects would produce a completely different effect in far more complex brains, those of primates. Instead of poison, a stimulant. Instead of death, alertness. Caffeine blocks a brain receptor called adenosine, which is responsible for signaling tiredness to the body. By occupying that receptor without activating it, caffeine tricks the brain into feeling awake even when it should be exhausted. It was this evolutionary accident, this biochemical coincidence between a plant weapon and a primate brain, that would make caffeine thousands of years later indispensable to billions of people. The highlands of present-day Ethiopia, in the historic region of Kaffa, are considered the original birthplace of the wild coffee shrub. Their local communities, long before any written record, already chewed the red seeds of the wild shrub mixed with animal fat, creating a kind of primitive energy bar used by warriors and travelers before long journeys. They did not drink coffee as we know it today. They ate the plant. There is a popular legend, and proven historically, about a goat herder named Kaldi who supposedly noticed his goats becoming agitated and unable to sleep after eating the red fruit of a particular shrub. Curious, he supposedly tried the fruit himself and felt the same effect, bringing the seeds to a local monk, who allegedly threw them into a fire in disapproval, accidentally releasing the roasted aroma we know today. The story is charming, but almost certainly apocryphal, first recorded centuries after the events it describes supposedly took place. What is known with more certainty is that coffee consumption, in the form we drink it today, arose not in Ethiopia, but on the other side of the Red Sea, on the Arabian Peninsula. It was in Yemen between the 15th and 16th centuries that Sufi monks began preparing a dark, bitter drink from roasted, ground coffee beans, using it to stay awake during long nights of prayer and spiritual devotion. The port city of Mocha would become, for centuries, a worldwide synonym for the drink, giving rise to the very name we still use today for a specific type of coffee. From there, the drink spread rapidly through Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. The first coffee houses in history emerged, known as kahvekhana, spaces where men gathered to talk, play games, discuss politics, and listen to music, often activities restricted in other, stricter social contexts. These coffee houses became so socially influential that religious and political authorities began to fear them. And here is a pattern that will repeat itself several times throughout this story. Whatever would later become indispensable was, at first, deeply feared. In 1511, in Mecca, the Governor Khair Beg ordered coffee houses shut down and the drink banned, fearing that the gatherings would fuel criticism of his rule. He argued before religious authorities that coffee had effects comparable to those of wine, which is forbidden in Islam. The ban did not last. The Sultan of Cairo, Khair Beg's superior, reversed the decision shortly afterward, but the episode reveals how coffee, from very early on, was seen not merely as a drink, but as a political threat. Over the following century, similar bans would repeatedly appear and disappear across different parts of the Ottoman Empire, always motivated less by the drink itself and more by what it represented. Ordinary people gathering, talking, and thinking freely. Curiously, a similar resistance had already arisen on the Ottoman side, though for opposite reasons. While in Christian Europe the fear was religious contamination from the Islamic world, within the Ottoman Empire itself, some religious leaders condemned coffee for considering it an intoxicating substance, comparable to wine, and therefore incompatible with stricter Islamic precepts. Sultan Murad IV, in the early 17th century, went so far as to ban the consumption of coffee, tobacco, and alcohol in Constantinople under penalty of death, in an attempt to curb both the supposed vice and the political gatherings taking place in coffee houses, which he saw as hotbeds of conspiracy against his rule. Accounts from the period describe extremely harsh punishments for those who disobeyed. Even so, the habit survived the Sultan, and decades later coffee would once again flow freely through the streets of the city we now know as Istanbul. This pattern of attempted control, followed by failure, would repeat itself endlessly. Rulers repeatedly discovered, over and over across the centuries, how difficult it was to ban something that had already taken deep root in everyday habits. The problem was never really the drink. It was what it represented. Ordinary people gathered together, alert, talking, and occasionally questioning whoever held power. It was precisely this kind of freewheeling conversation that would flourish fully once coffee finally conquered Western Europe. While coffee slowly won over the Middle East, on the other side of the Asian continent, a completely different plant had already traveled a similar path centuries earlier. In ancient China, the consumption of tea leaves dates back millennia, also wrapped in legend. One of the best-known attributes the discovery to the mythical emperor Shennong, who supposedly noticed the plant's properties by accident when dried leaves fell into water he was boiling. Like the story of Kaldi, this is a cultural tradition, not a provable historical fact, but it reveals how different civilizations, independently, created nearly identical narratives to explain the discovery of stimulant plants, an accident, followed by a revelation. What exists in more concrete form is the record that tea, initially used for medicinal purposes in China, gradually became a social drink and, later, a central element of ritual, philosophy, and cultural identity, especially during the Tang and Song dynasties. The tea ceremony would later spread to Japan, taking on deep spiritual and aesthetic meaning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, in the tropical forests of Mesoamerica, civilizations such as the Olmecs, and later the Maya and the Aztecs had already independently discovered the stimulant properties of cacao seeds. For these civilizations, cacao was not merely food. It was sacred. The Aztecs believed the plant had been a gift from the god Quetzalcoatl to humanity. Cacao seeds were so valuable that they functioned as currency, used to buy food, pay tribute, and even to bribe. Notice the pattern forming. 3 continents, 3 civilizations with no contact between them, 3 completely different plants, and yet the same outcome: discovery, ritual, or medicinal use, and eventual transformation into a central social and economic element. But not every caffeinated plant received such a warm welcome at first. When coffee began arriving in Europe in the early 17th century, brought by Venetian traders who dealt with the Ottoman Empire, it was met with deep suspicion. Christian religious authorities associated it with the Muslim world, going so far as to call it, disparagingly, Satan's bitter wine. According to a popular and widely repeated account, though its exact historical accuracy is debated, clergy allegedly asked Pope Clement VIII to ban the drink because of its Islamic origins. The Pope, curious, supposedly decided to try coffee before judging it, and, upon liking the drink, is said to have remarked that it would be a shame to let infidels enjoy something so delicious all by themselves, deciding to baptize it so Christians could drink it too. True or not, this story circulated widely and helped legitimize coffee consumption in Christian Europe. From there, coffee houses began spreading through Venice, Oxford, London, Paris, and Vienna, becoming centers of intellectual, commercial, and political discussion. In London, they became known as penny universities. For just 1 penny, anyone could enter, drink coffee, and take part in conversations with merchants, scientists, writers, and politicians. Many modern financial institutions were literally born inside coffee houses. Lloyd's of London, today one of the largest insurance markets in the world, began as a coffee house frequented by ship owners and maritime merchants in the late 17th century. In Vienna, a popular local tradition claims that the coffee habit arose after the Ottoman siege of the city in 1683, when retreating Turkish troops supposedly left behind sacks of green beans that the Viennese, unsure what to do with them, eventually learned to roast and brew. The story, although widely told in tourist guides and historic cafes in the city to this day, is considered by many historians to be more urban legend than proven fact, since trade in coffee between Vienna and the Ottoman world likely already existed before the siege. True or not, the tradition of the Viennese coffeehauser would flourish in the following centuries, becoming a meeting point for composers, philosophers, and, later, figures such as Sigmund Freud, who spent hours discussing ideas at cafe tables in the heart of the Austrian capital. But not every ruler looked kindly on this new culture of public gathering. In 1675, King Charles II of England attempted to shut down all coffee houses in the country, claiming there were places where rumors and criticism of the crown spread. The ban lasted only a few days in the face of public backlash. The king backed down. Coffee houses remained open, and England, decades later, would become one of the largest consumers of a completely different caffeinated drink, tea. It was exactly this shift in English national preference from coffee to tea that would set off one of the most surprising chains of events in this entire history. The British East India Company, which already dominated trade routes for textiles and spices, began importing ever larger quantities of tea from China throughout the 18th century, turning the drink into a British national habit. The problem was that China demanded payment in silver, and Britain began accumulating a worrying trade deficit. The solution the British found was a dark one. They began growing opium in colonial India and selling it illegally in China, reversing the flow of silver in their favor. When the Chinese government tried to put an end to the trade, Britain responded with military force, triggering the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. The result was devastating for China, which lost territory, commercial sovereignty, and saw its population suffer from widespread opium addiction. An English cup of tea, so associated today with calm and tradition, carries within its history one of the most destructive wars of modern imperialism. Tea would also shape, quite directly, the birth of a new nation on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1773, American colonists unhappy with British taxes on tea organized a protest that became known as the Boston Tea Party, dumping hundreds of crates of tea into the city's harbor. The episode would become one of the symbolic sparks of the American Revolution. It is ironic to note that, partly because of this protest, the United States would become, generations later, one of the largest coffee-consuming nations on the planet. Coffee came to be seen as a patriotic drink, in contrast to British tea. While coffee and tea were reshaping politics on different continents, their physical expansion depended on something far darker: enslaved labor. As European demand for coffee grew, colonial powers sought ways to cultivate it outside its region of origin. The Dutch managed, in the early 18th century, to smuggle coffee seedlings to their colonies in Indonesia, especially the island of Java, for which would later come the informal expression, a cup of Java, to refer to coffee. The French, in turn, brought seedlings to the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, where cultivation would grow explosively at the cost of a brutal system of enslaved labor. Within a few decades, Saint-Domingue would become responsible for an enormous share of all the coffee consumed in Europe, sustained by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans working under inhumane conditions. That same system of exploitation would repeat itself on an even larger scale in Brazil. In the early 19th century, coffee seedlings arrived in the country from French Guiana. According to a popularly told account, the Brazilian officer Francisco de Melo Palhita supposedly seduced the wife of the French governor of Guiana in order to smuggle coffee seeds hidden inside a bouquet of flowers, a story frequently repeated, but whose full historical accuracy cannot be confirmed through solid documentation. What is well documented historically is that from these first seedlings, coffee spread across the Brazilian interior, especially through the Paraíba Valley and later western São Paulo state, sustained by one of the largest systems of slavery in the world. Brazil would become, over the course of the 19th century, the world's largest coffee producer, a position it still holds today. But the growth of this industry cost the lives and freedom of millions of enslaved Africans who worked on Brazilian coffee plantations until abolition in 1888. The same pattern of colonial exploitation would repeat itself with another caffeinated plant, far less discussed in Western documentaries. The kola nut, native to West Africa, chewed traditionally for centuries in social and religious rituals across various African cultures before being appropriated, in the late 19th century, by American businessmen who would incorporate it as an ingredient in a new bottled drink that would change the beverage industry forever. In 1886, pharmacist John Pemberton, in Atlanta, in the United States, created a syrup blending coca leaf extract with kola nut extract, originally sold as a medicinal tonic in pharmacies. The product's name came directly from its two original ingredients, coca and cola. Cocaine would be removed from the formula decades later, but caffeine, extracted from the kola nut, remained a core ingredient. What began as a pharmacy remedy would become, over the course of the 20th century, one of the most valuable and recognizable brands on the planet. Meanwhile, in South America, indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin had already been cultivating guarana for centuries, its seeds containing one of the highest natural concentrations of caffeine among all known plants. And further south, Guarani communities had already been drinking yerba mate for generations, a beverage that would become a central cultural element in countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, and parts of Brazil and Paraguay. 6 plants, 6 distinct continents or regions, the same molecule, and, increasingly, the same fate becoming global commodities. As the world entered the Industrial Revolution, in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, the relationship between human beings and caffeine would change permanently. Before, coffee and tea were, for the most part, drinks of leisure, social ritual, or religious use. In factories, they became tools of productivity. Workers whose days had once been organized by the natural cycle of the sun began working rigid shifts, often overnight, controlled by clocks and machines. The human body was not biologically prepared for this new rhythm. Coffee and tea became the fuels that allowed the industrial workforce to stay alert beyond the body's natural limits. Employers even began offering tea breaks as a way of maintaining workers' productivity, a practice that gave rise to the British tradition of the tea break, still present today. It was precisely in this context, in 1819, that Goethe, intrigued by the effects of the drink increasingly conquering industrial Europe, asked the young chemist Runge to scientifically investigate what was inside coffee. Runge managed to isolate the pure substance, initially naming it caffabase. A few years later, French chemists would independently arrive at the same compound, and the name that would prevail was caffeine, derived from the word coffee itself. For the first time in human history, the substance that moved empires, financed colonial wars, and sustained the labor force of entire factories, finally had a scientific name and a chemical formula. The mystery blindly consumed for millennia had finally been decoded. But identifying caffeine did not mean controlling it. It meant, in fact, opening the door to producing and using it on a scale never before imagined. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, science advanced rapidly in understanding how caffeine acted on the human body. At the same time, the pharmaceutical industry began extracting pure caffeine to add to medicines for headaches, colds, and fatigue. Coca-Cola had already shown, commercially, that a bottled, mass-produced caffeinated drink could become an unprecedented consumer phenomenon. The 20th century would dramatically accelerate this trajectory. The two world wars would definitively establish caffeine as a strategic military tool. Coffee and caffeine tablets were distributed to soldiers in both conflicts to combat exhaustion in combat, overnight watches, and long marches. Coffee, specifically, became so essential to the American war effort that, during the Second World War, its rationing in the United States generated strong public dissatisfaction, and the Brazilian government, the world's leading supplier, saw its coffee production become a key bargaining chip in diplomatic negotiations with the United States. After the war, the explosion of mass consumption, television advertising, and accelerated urban culture would permanently turn coffee, tea, and caffeinated sodas into billion-dollar daily habits. Companies like Nestle, which launched instant Nescafé coffee in 1938 originally to solve surplus Brazilian coffee production, would make the drink even more accessible and quick to prepare, suited to the increasingly fast pace of 20th century urban and corporate life. In the 1980s, a new wave arrived: energy drinks. The Austrian company Red Bull, inspired by tonic drinks already popular in Asia, launched in 1987 a product combining caffeine with taurine and sugar in much higher concentrations than traditional sodas, creating a billion-dollar global market specifically focused on fast energy, today contested by dozens of brands around the world. And, at the same time, science would reveal a more complex side of this centuries-old relationship between humans and caffeine: its genuine capacity to create physical dependence. Neurological studies confirm that regular caffeine use alters the number of adenosine receptors in the brain, leading to progressive tolerance and genuine withdrawal symptoms, such as headaches, irritability, and fatigue, when consumption is abruptly stopped. The same substance once used to poison insects for the plant's protection now creates, in billions of human brains, a daily cycle of mild but real dependence, repeated silently with every morning cup. Today, caffeine is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance on the planet, far surpassing alcohol, nicotine, or any other legal or illegal drug in absolute number of daily users. It is estimated that most of the world's adult population regularly consumes caffeine, whether through coffee, tea, sodas, energy drinks, chocolate, or medication. The international coffee trade alone generates tens of billions of dollars annually, sustaining the economy of dozens of producing countries, mostly located in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, many of which still face structural inequalities directly inherited from the colonial period in which this entire production chain was originally built on slave labor and exploitation. Brazil remains the world's largest coffee producer, followed by Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia, and Ethiopia, the very country where, according to legend, it all supposedly began with a goat herder and his restless flock. China, the historic birthplace of tea, remains among the largest producers and consumers of the drink, alongside India, whose plantations in Assam and Darjeeling were born directly out of Britain's commercial collapse with China during the Opium Wars. The energy drink industry grows year after year, especially among young people, fueling ongoing debates about safe consumption limits, advertising aimed at teenagers, and cardiovascular risks associated with excessive use. At the same time, contemporary movements around specialty coffee, artisanal roasting, and direct trade with producers attempt, at least partially, to correct centuries of exploitation, valuing small farmers and seeking fair production chains, a direct contrast to the history of slavery and monopolies that, for centuries defined this same supply chain. Curiously, a growing share of consumers today seek exactly the opposite of what drove this entire history: coffee without caffeine. The decaffeination process, developed commercially in the early 20th century by German merchant Ludwig Roselius, emerged after, according to account from the company he would go on to found, a shipment of coffee was accidentally soaked in seawater during an ocean crossing, resulting in beans partially free of caffeine without a complete loss of flavor. The anecdote, repeated for generations in the brand's own advertising materials, cannot be independently confirmed, but the chemical process he developed from that observation would give rise to the modern decaffeinated coffee industry. Present today in virtually every coffee shop in the world, a version of the very same drink, deliberately stripped of the thing that made it historic in the first place. Modern science has also brought important nuance to this story. Research suggests that moderate caffeine consumption may be associated with cognitive benefits and even a lower risk of certain diseases, while excessive consumption, especially among teenagers and through highly concentrated energy drinks, is associated with cardiovascular problems, anxiety, and sleep disorders. Health authorities in many countries now recommend daily consumption limits, something unthinkable just a few centuries ago, when the very chemical existence of the substance was still a complete mystery. Turn, for a moment, to that cup on your table, that glass of iced tea, that can of soda or energy drink in your bag. What sits in front of you is not merely a drink. It is the final result of a molecule originally created by plants to kill insects, independently discovered by entire civilizations on different continents, banned by kings, popes, and sultans, smuggled aboard ships, cultivated on the shoulders of millions of enslaved people, chemically isolated by a curious poet and a young scientist, turned into a strategic weapon during world wars, bottled by pharmacists, and, finally, handed back to you every single day as an absolutely normal part of your routine. It began as plant poison. It became spiritual ritual. Then, a commodity fought over by empires. Then, fuel for factories and wars. Then, pure science, isolated in a laboratory flask. And today, it is simply part of your day, so ordinary that almost no one stops to think about how or why it ever got there. Next time you feel that familiar relief after the first sip of morning coffee, it might be worth remembering that in a matter of seconds, you are experiencing the very same effect that once drove monks through nighttime vigils, Venetian merchants, rebellious colonists in Boston, soldiers in trenches, and scientists in laboratories across more than 1,000 years of human history. If this story changed the way you think about something as simple as a cup of coffee, subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories behind the things we use every single day without ever imagining where they truly came from.